Today, it's time for an origin story. Our origin story. Gamebooks and fighting fantasy in particular aren't strictly tabletop RPGs, and they certainly weren't originally aimed at older players either. But there's far more to this than meets the eye. And to help us dive into the world of interactive fiction, we are joined today by a true titan of the genre, an author with more than 80 published books to his name, over 30 of which are gamebooks, including 8 official entries into the legendary fighting fantasy series. On top of that, he stands as the genre's foremost historian, having penned the history of fighting fantasy gamebooks. You are the hero. Please welcome to RPG Blokes, Jonathan Green.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Great to see you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Didn't overhype, did we? We might have underhyped.
Okay, good. So do want to just lay out the format of our podcast today. For our listeners, which we are used to introducing to new systems and new concepts, and I think a lot of people that listen to us are quite new to the hobby in general, we'd like to start at the basics of gamebooks and just explain what they're all about, and then look at the impact they've had on the hobby as a whole, their ongoing appeal, and how they cross over into RPGs. And then your work in particular, what you've published, and ask you some other questions toward the end if we have the time too.
Okay. So at its most basic level, a game book is a branching narrative. So you'll have section 1, you read to the bottom of the page, and then you're given 2 choices, say, go to 2 or 3, for argument's sake. And then you make the choice, and the story unfolds based on the choices you have made. So I'm a bit of a purist. So people will sometimes say, oh, like a choose your own adventure book. And that is it's a bit like a Hoover or a Tannoy. That's a particular line of books. They're specific publications. And for me, those aren't actually game books because there's no problem to solve. It's literally you go to here and it splits into 2 ways and they'll split and they'll split and they'll split. So there's not a puzzle to solve. There's not a quest to complete. It's just, let's see what happens if we go this way, which is rather like, I think, rolling dice for a game of Snakes and Ladders, because Snakes and Ladders isn't really a game. There is no strategy involved at all. It's purely what happens with the dice. So for me, a game book has to have some element of a quest. So that doesn't mean you have to have dice to roll. You can have a branching narrative that is a game book that has no other embellishments, but there's some sort of puzzle that or a route you have to find that's the correct one. But of course, most people think of game books as having some basic role-playing game element to it. Again, at its most basic, that's rolling dice. But then there have been diceless game books as well. The virtual reality series that Dave Morris was involved in, those have, there's no random dice rolls, but depending on choices you make, you can lose stat points and gain stat points. So there is still that element to it. Yeah, so for me, it's a branching narrative with a problem to solve and some sort of basic RPG mechanics attached.
Yeah, so when you say the RPG mechanics, because I looked into the history of these books, and like you say, the Choose Your Own Adventure books, that's very much what it is all about, especially for our American listeners. They would be very familiar with those type of books. They didn't have a very strong fantasy feel or narrative about them. So in the original game books as we know them, and that led us into the role-playing game hobby, the fighting fantasy series, were they the first to come along with that kind of concept, character sheets, and sort of almost merge Dungeons and Dragons tropes into game books? Were they the first to do it?
Yeah, they were. I mean, there's a slight question because there was Tunnels and Trolls, which was around the same time. Might have been slightly beforehand, but you can get really pernickety with these sort of things. But I think that's one of the early solo role-playing games. It wasn't a game book in the truest sense. I'm not an expert on Tunnels and Trolls by any means, but with fighting fantasy, yes. And sorry, just go back what you said about the point about the Choose Your Own Adventures not necessarily being fantasy. I think that's one of their strengths, in that they showed literally anything can be a branching narrative and interactive story. And because fighting fantasy had such a massive impact on the genre and wider culture, and then Lone Wolf did in a similar way, they were both fantasy settings. And you'll see now loads of people who are of a certain age, like myself, who are then now writing their own series. They're not always, but they're almost always fantasy. The fact that Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone were riffing off Dungeons and Dragons without obviously, rubbing the serial numbers off, so there's no copyright involved. But I think that's where it started. And also that kind of Tolkien-esque element to it. So a lot of people now, they think of game books, they think of fantasy adventures.
Yeah.
They didn't pitch a game book to begin with. It was they had Games Day that they were holding in London. And Geraldine Cook, who is a Penguin commissioning editor, so the adult branch of the publishers, approached and they got chatting. And I think they effectively persuaded her to publish a how-to book about role-playing games because it was a new phenomenon. But then when they sat down to write it, they thought that the better way is to actually show people what it's like. And they were proved right because later Ian Livingstone wrote Dicing with Dragons, which was effectively a how-to play role-playing games, and it didn't sell half as well as the Fighting Fantasy books did. So Fighting Fantasy threw you into it by getting you to actually do it.
Yeah, that to us was the most important part of them and what drew us through into role-playing games. But, I mean, it was a phenomenon at the time. Crossed over, didn't it? It drew people that wouldn't have normally been reading books into doing so. Was that something that was planned?
Honestly, I think that was a side effect. Geraldine couldn't persuade anybody at Penguin to take it on, but instead she took it to Puffin. So it then became a children's book. So although I think the series grew up with its readership, which there's positives to that and negatives, it was primarily aimed at children. So the books were shorter, partly because it was just a little bit at a time. The fact that the reader had the agency, they were rolling dice. And also it wasn't very long before something exciting happened. There wasn't lots of exposition or, dare I say, character development. But it's, no, you're the hero. And not only that, but it's like, you might be like I was 10 years old when I picked up the first one, not very good at sport. And then suddenly I could wield a sword and kill a dragon. You know, it was a real bit of wish fulfillment, I think.
So you were 10 years old when you bought your first book. Which one was it, by the way?
It was The Warlock of Fartop Mountain. Yeah, so that came out in 1982, and I was 11 in the October of 1982. Well, the way I remember it now, whether this is true or not, but this is how I remember it, is that I'd got taken into Bath. I lived just outside by my mum to, I don't know, buy new shoes for school or something.
Yeah.
And then we went into Waterstones, and it was on a table in the middle of the bookshop. And the first thing that stood out was the cover, which had the wizard conjuring this dragon from a crystal ball. I didn't appreciate it at the time, but the actual layout of the cover is really unusual because it has the title of the book in the middle of the page, in the middle of the cover. And you generally don't do that because if they're stacked in racks, you wouldn't see the title. I think that was because Peter Andrew Jones had sort of recycled a painting he'd already produced for something else, as I understand it, or maybe he'd adapted it. So I picked it up, opened it, and again, what I remember is Russ Nicholson's drawing of the ghoul, which is looking directly out of the page. You know, it's a corpse with its flesh all ripped up. It's got claws. It looks like it's about to tear your face off. So the first thing that grabbed me was the art. I don't remember how much of it I read to find out what it might be about, probably the back cover. But my mum said, yep. And I then, you know, the rest is history.
Yeah, that was it. We haven't covered artwork much, but the artwork, like you said, when you first picked up the Warlock, that's what drew you in. And there's almost like spoilers, aren't they? So you look at them and you analyze them and you look at, you love them and you're thinking, I want to get to that part of the adventure.
Or the blood beast. Yeah.
They've got one of those in there.
Trying to avoid that.
The art was so brilliant that it just made you want to play the book. And that'd be the first thing I did. If I went into a bookstore and wanted to buy another Fighting Fantasy or any book, I'd look at the art first.
There was also a fairly iconic style, wasn't there? There was like the thick, I'm sure it's done for printing purposes, but the thick, like heavy black ink stylings that appeared in that whole era for almost any.
Well, it's like D&D ones,
they were really, a lot of them were done by the same artists. But
like you say, it has a certain feel and it's amazing. There's still people who do great pen and ink work like that now. But as printing techniques improved, so the artists could try the things. So if you look at Martin McKenna's work throughout Fighting Fantasy, it starts off, I think his first one, he was only 17 years old when he illustrated Daggers of Darkness. And there's lots of pen and ink, but he also used the letraset shading, the dots on the things. And then later he started working digitally and he almost did a scraper board style. So you can see it quite clearly in Howl of the Werewolf. He didn't just draw in black. He sometimes drew in white on black, or he had sort of a grayscale shading. And you can see grayscale now in people's illustrations. And it's, what you can do with the printing is more advanced, but equally it was that kind of necessity as the mother of invention, isn't it? You had this amazing use of shadow and negative space just by having simple pen. You'd say simple pen and ink, but to try and replicate that is incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
Amazing work.
We've spoken in a previous podcast about the Satanic Panic. Was Fighting Fantasy caught up in that at all in the 80s? I can't remember whether
it was.
Yeah, it did.
Yes,
House of Hell probably caught a bit of flack.
people wrote Puffin books complaining. I'm not sure if it got into the press, but there was one piece or some bit where a mother had written in saying that after reading one of these books, her child levitated. So, as Sirian tells it, one of his stories, kids think for sort of £1.25 I can learn to fly. I like some of that.
That is it.
And there was a vicar who threatened to chain himself to the railings outside Penguin offices, but there aren't any railings there.
Work of the
I
devil.
will install the railings if whoever he wants to.
Some of my mum's friends were slightly concerned about it, and she pointed out, it's made up. I mean, she was a teacher and a great advocate for reading, so she pointed out that the idea in the books is that you are the hero. Of course, looking back now, when you look at the first one, Warlock of Far Top Mountain, later on it's retconned so that Zagor the Warlock is a properly evil character. But in the first one, there's rumours of this old guy who lives under the mountain with his treasure, and you basically break in, kill all his servants, and nick his stuff. So as they say now, murder hobo. But yeah, I wasn't going to point that out to my mum. I probably didn't realise at the time anyway.
No, because we've spoken about this in the past. We looked at it and think, what are you worrying about? We're the least likely people that that's going to get involved in anything untoward.
Too busy with our snouts in books.
Yeah. I think part of it is that now that fantasy has become mainstream, it doesn't have that fear. People are much more understand what fantasy is and probably have some sort of fantasy show or movie or book series that they enjoy themselves. So they look more kindly upon it. But, they're still popular children. I worked as a school librarian for a few years, and they would love poring over the books when the Scholastic reprinted them and playing them together, it's funny because that then makes it more like a role-playing game. But that's one of the really nice things to see with children when they're sort of supporting each other in that way.
Yeah, we are going to talk about the crossover into role-playing games, but we thought we'd leave that until later in the podcast because there are many ways to cross over from Gamebooks into role-playing, and they're a brilliant gateway to do so, for adults too.
Yeah.
And also, they're a brilliant bit if you're in a dry spell between games or not knowing other players.
Yes.
Early 80s for me.
Yeah.
Long dry spells, and the Fighting Fantasy books and a few others in the genre definitely got me through.
I do think that was part of the appeal, and probably still is, and that you maybe meet your gaming group once a week or once a month, and in between times, or you go away on holiday, and you can still get that quick fix.
Yeah, we always took them on holiday, didn't we? In fact, we bought them on holiday, didn't we? Our books, and then
there are so many stories about people first coming across them on a holiday because it's that sort of go to a caravan park and it's raining, not like it is at the moment, of course. So they get taken to local bookshop, and then what's this? Oh, if it'll keep you quiet, I'll get that for you.
Absolutely.
And again, everything about them, I liken them slightly to the girls' magazines of the era when I was growing up, and that Just 17 was targeted at 14-year-olds. So you've got these kids' books which have, as you say, artwork which wouldn't be able to place on a role-playing game that would maybe be played by adults. So I think that's a massive draw for the children.
Yeah, and you mentioned the price already, like $125 for a book. That's pocket money territory even back in the 80s, isn't it?
Yeah, rather than saying I want the red box D&D, to say I want a paperback. And the fact, as you also mentioned, they were in libraries. So libraries doing their good work.
And Smiths. That was what made it accessible. W.H. Smiths in every town.
The high streets.
Yeah.
And what I do notice about them too is that the protagonist who you are being placed through the eyes of is an adult within the books as well, isn't it? It doesn't come across as the fact you're playing a child. It seems like I'm playing a man. I guess that was quite appealing at the time, but something that's maybe helped their longevity in respects of people of our age still sort of dipping into them.
That is a good point. Because now you mention that, there's a couple I can specifically think of. The Crimson Tide, you start off as a child, and part of it is you grow up during the course of the book. And also Battle Blade Warrior, you're the child of the Queen of Vimorna, which is a city under siege from lizard men. So I think that implies you're a youth, maybe, but I guess a teenager. But yeah, you're right. You're effectively an adult in this fantasy world.
Yeah, I think that helps for me to sort of dip back into them now.
You was a monster in Creature of Chaos.
I was going to say the Creature of Havoc was a monster, I remember,
Havoc.
So you were very young.
I mean, that was one of the things was Steve Jackson particularly, he didn't like writing the same book. So if you look at he didn't do as many, but they're all very different. So he co-wrote The Warlock of Far Top Mountain with Sirian, the first one. Then he did, they each did their own solo one. So he did something quite similar, but it was Citadel of Chaos, and it introduced a magic system. You had to choose your spells, and there was a cost to using them. And the final battle isn't just here's the bad guy, here's his stats, roll some dice. You get to choose how you conduct the battle, which spells you might use, what other tricks you might try. Then his next one was Starship Traveller, so sci-fi. Further down the line, he wrote Appointment with Fear, which was a superhero one.
I love that one.
Creature of Havoc, in which you are the monster. And part of that is you wake up at the start with no memory of who you are. And so many people have riffed off that since. There are so many.
Yeah.
It's quite a familiar trope now in game books.
Yeah, I love that one. You had to piece together the language, I think, in that one, didn't you? And you sort of like had gobbledygook on the page and you had to work it out.
That was really hard. I mean, Steve also used to write puzzles. I think it was for the Daily Telegraph. So he loved all that sort of thing.
I love that, yeah.
I mean, that's so hard because the spacing between the words means nothing. The gaps aren't actually gaps when you translate it. It's very cleverly worked out, but very difficult.
Yeah, I played that for you a few times and thought clever the second time round. It was go back and just sort of like piece together some of the things that was said to you really early. It was all great, yeah. It's all well thought about, yeah.
Citadel of Chaos, my first one. Today, I've still not managed to honestly finish Warlock. Can't make my way to it. Always get lost in the maze bit. But yeah, Citadel of Chaos, I played that over and over. I think that was the precursor for the magic system in the sorcery books.
It was, yes. So I think, how to get it right now, I think it might have only been by a year or two. But yeah, what he'd sort of done in Citadel of Chaos, he then expanded with sorcery.
Yeah. I love those.
They were brilliant, the sorcery books.
Yeah, I mean, that's another thing where it was a first. They're all a connected epic. And the fact that a locket you can find in book 1 can influence events in book 4. I mean, it was very, very cleverly worked out.
Yeah, and the books got bigger and bigger as you went along. I love that part about it as well.
The Fighting Fantasy books, people who don't know, were generally 400 sections long. Some of them were a bit shorter. Freeway Fighter was one of those, and I think Starship Traveller, the first version. But then, yes, the first sorcery book, The Shamatanti Hills, was over 400 sections. And the final one, The Crown of Kings, I think is about 800.
Beautiful. I never completed it, but I did love it.
Yeah.
I mean, we're getting to the point really in the podcast where we're talking about the fact that you eventually wrote Fighting Fantasy books within the series. What a proud moment that would have been, I can only imagine.
It was, yeah.
How did that happen for you? How did you end up doing that?
As long as I knew that writing books was a thing, I wanted to be a writer. I knew that. So when I was about 6 years old, I'd make small books out of bits of paper and staple them together. Often there wasn't really any content, but I'd draw the covers and I'd come up with the titles. And I still think Stubby Pencil is a good name for a character for a book. But anyway, I haven't written it yet. But almost 50 years later, who knows? I then started writing as I became more proficient. And I remember when I was 7 or 8 at school, our teacher got us to write about an alien called Big Eye who came down in his spaceship. And most people just wrote a story and that was it. And I just kept going. But also, it was utter drivel, partly because I thought quantity was quality. So if they went down a long corridor, it would say they ran down a long corridor. And some people would still say that I overuse adjectives, but they should have read that stuff. But I worked it through the system. So any creative writing work at school, I loved. Then I discovered Fighting Fantasy books. So of course I started pastiching those. And at the end of, well, what would it be now? It'd be called year 8, wouldn't it? My teacher wrote to my parents in my end of year report about the fact that I'd spend form time sort of writing these adventure game books. Again, they never really went anywhere. I never finished anything, but I kept plugging away. And I think I was maybe 15 or 16 when I wrote my first 200 section game book and actually finished it, but I also illustrated it myself. So when it came to actually writing a Fighting Fantasy game book, I hadn't written one that length before.
Okay.
But when I left university, I wrote to Puffin saying, can I write game books for you? They could have completely ignored me, but instead I got this letter back from somebody called Mark Gascoigne, who was the consultant editor of Fighting Fantasy. And obviously Mark and I have a long history now, and we're both working together on Fighting Fantasy in different ways again. But at various times he's been my co-author, my editor, my publisher. He was my landlord for about 15 months as well. So we go way back now. But yeah, he wrote the letter and it said, what you need to do, you need to write a quarter of the book as it would appear. You need to give a detailed synopsis of what happens next. He made the point about not hiding the ending, which anybody who wants to get their book published, never send a letter saying, and if you want to know what happens, you'll have to buy my book, because that's a guaranteed way to get filed in the round filing cabinet in the corner. But I remember him finishing off by saying, I should warn you that your chances of publication are very slim. So I then sat down to write, I called it The Outlaws of Khan, because I'd read a name on one of the maps of Alancia as Khan, and it was actually Card. So it's Kaaad. D as opposed to AAN, but the way it was written on the map, it was slightly confusing to me. And I submitted this, I think it was maybe the end of my first year at uni. I wrote this idea up, sent it off, and Mark replied with polite feedback, but saying tactfully it's not very good, and it wasn't. He said, no, have another go. So I did, reworked the pitch, and he wrote back saying, yeah, I still like this bit and this bit, but it's not really going anywhere. Maybe have a rethink. So I then put it to one side. And at the end of my second year at university, I started writing what would become Spellbreaker, my first published book. And that took, I had to rewrite it once for Mark. Then he thought it was good enough to send to the commissioning editor at Puffin, Richard Scrivener. I had to do another rewrite. And then I realized that I'm telling you this completely the wrong way around, because it must have been the end of my first. So end of school, I wrote my first idea. End of my first year, I started on Spellbreaker, because at the end of my second year, I got the commissioning letter to say, yes, you can now write your game book.
Wow.
And Mark wrote, again in that one, that sticks in my mind. It said, I'll now let you pass out with happiness. And my dad said to me, and no, don't get nervous now and not finish it. But that's never been a problem since. But yeah, so I spent my summer, I had a gardening job, and I wrote my first book. So my university summer job paid far better than everybody else's. But I'd like to say that the earnings then went up incrementally. But
no. And that was your first published book. That was the actual first thing you had published. I know you've written a lot of other things other than Gamebooks. We're not really here to talk about those so much today, but that was, so your first published work was that Gamebook.
It was. So it was published in 1993. Yeah, so it's 33 years old now.
Yeah, by that time, we're in our early 20s and we're moving on to different stage of our life. So we would be honest, we haven't played your Gamebooks as much as we have done the early ones, but we know of them, of course. And
don't worry, a lot of people had moved on by then. I think lots of my friends at school, it was a real craze, Fighting Fantasy. Everybody read them up to about number 10.
Yeah.
And I don't really know what happened, but lots of other people I know discovered the opposite sex. Me, not so much. But I never stopped reading them. People, when I was at uni, they knew that I enjoyed them. Friends of mine bought them for me. I didn't buy every single one because I couldn't afford to. But my friends at uni would buy them for birthday presents. They always knew I wanted to be a writer. The third one is actually dedicated to some friends from my course. And again, I've dedicated various ones to them since. But I always say that I've had various jobs, one of which was a teacher for many years, but I am a writer. I was a writer before I was paid to write. And it's something that even now, if I don't do it for a while, I get antsy. I have that urge to get something down on paper.
Yeah. So what makes a good game book then? What was what did you do, you think, that drew their attention?
Well, with Spellbreaker, there is a lot that's wrong with it. As people who've read it will know, my early game books were incredibly hard, possibly impossibly hard.
Yeah.
And part of the issue is that I was writing books for people like myself, because you always say as an author, you are your first reader. And by that point, I didn't roll any dice. So I cheated. So I tried to make the books cheat-proof.
That was a question.
Yeah.
But in the process, I forgot that people also want to have fun. And what you should be doing is writing the book for the people who want to play it fairly. Because if they want to cheat, well, it's up to them. And it probably means they're enjoying the story. So I will say in Spellbreaker's defense, I think it's quite a good story.
Yeah.
And I was inspired massively by Stephen Hand. He wrote Dead of Night with Jim Bamber, but he also wrote Moonrunner and Legend of the Shadow Warriors. So with Dead of Night and Legend of the Shadow Warriors, there's various villages you can visit. So it's not like I go down a road, you turn left or right. You were given proper destinations, and then something happened at that place. So I mimicked that in. So it wasn't so much of a, you go down a corridor and open a door and there's this in the room. It's, you go to this village and they've got a rat infestation. You go to this village and there's plague. You go to this village and a witch is on trial. So it kind of created interesting encounters and scenarios that way. So I think the story and the atmosphere is good. The game design is poor. So going back to what makes a good book, I feel you do want a compelling plot, a compelling story, but you have to give your readers agency as well, because there are other game books I've read where it feels to me like the person really wants to be writing a novel. So you'll read a section and then at the bottom it'll say, now turn to 14. So you turn to 14, you read that, now turn to 28. And it's like, well, when do I get to make a choice here? It's kind of, they've just broken it up a long section to make it easier to read maybe. So I feel you have to give the player agency, you have to give them choices, but also meaningful choices. So gone are the days where you can say, do you open the left door or the right door? You open the right door, a fireball hits you, you're dead. Mm-hmm. You've got to give some sort of clue to give people the opportunity, or if they make a mistake, there's a way to get out of it. And for me, some sort of fun mechanic, maybe some tweak to the rules or something that hasn't been done before. Because quite often the fighting fantasy books, as they went on, they added more bonus rules, and some of them there was quite a lot of bookkeeping to do. But if you've just got maybe one or something which is particular to that book, or one or two, I think makes it more manageable. Yeah, so engaging plot, agency, meaningful choices, and some sort of fun mechanic.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I was just going to ask, is there a minimum amount of fights you had to put into these books? Because obviously they're called fighting fantasy. I just wonder if it's tempting just to...
Someone got into trouble
No,
for that.
I was never given a number count. I would imagine if you'd sent in a pitch where you didn't really fight anything, they might have said something. But equally, they were originally sold on the idea that you could complete them with minimum stats, which quite quickly wasn't the case at all. It wasn't true, particularly not of mine.
So your books are very tough. I mean, that's hard, because I thought Warlock of Firetop Mountain, the one that kickstarted it all off, was one of the toughest ones of the ones I've played. Like John said, he hadn't managed to complete that.
Yeah.
So yours were impossibly difficult, some of them. But
yeah, well, the first few were, because there's one of the bad things about Spellbreaker, which I can see now, is that to complete it, you have to fail an attribute check. So you have to fail a skill score, I think it is, to end up in prison to meet a trainee witch, which is completely unfair.
Well, when everyone's cheating on their stats, it is.
Well, you always want to win. You always want to win.
Yeah.
So that was bad for a start. It's that classic thing now, which again, with hindsight, but you shouldn't ever hide vital information behind a dice roll. It's not good game design.
That passes over into role-playing games as well. If you want somebody to know something, do not ask for them to make a perception check.
Exactly.
You probably just tell them anyway.
That's right. But in the book, you've lost them at that point,
Knights of Doom, which came after it, again, I think it's a good story. I think it's a bit more linear, which maybe isn't as good. There's some interesting encounters, but there's lots of very highly powered enemies, which if you're playing fair, you haven't got a chance of fighting. And there were some quite complicated codes. And again, I've got a horrible feeling one of those was hidden behind a mistake, should we say. And then the third one, Curse of the Mummy, is probably one of the worst, for like the number of things you have to collect. And that said, at the end of Bloodbones, there is a whole sequence through a temple where you keep making dice rolls, and any one of them could end your game completely, which now I'm talking about it, it's like if I was an editor, I'd say that's terrible. So I like to think that since then, there was a bit of a break. Bloodbones is a weird one because it was commissioned by Puffin, but was never actually published. But from then onwards, when I got the opportunity to write more, I started to be more fair. The downside of that is I have had some of my game books criticised by fans for saying they're too easy. So
you can't win.
Swings and roundabouts.
Because you mentioned about Bloodbones, and we're going to talk now a little bit about why. Well, it hasn't come to an end completely, but it did stop, didn't it? The Bloodbones was meant to be the 60th book, was it?
That's right. Yeah.
And it must have been a very disappointing time.
Yeah. So I got the commission. I wrote the book, but at the time, they didn't know what to do with the series. This is Puffin, I should say.
Yeah.
And there were all sorts of things suggested, and one of them was that they were going to get Mark Gascoigne to rewrite all of the books to make them only 300 sections, not 400, which would have been a nigh on impossible task.
That sounds like an awful idea.
One of the more interesting ideas is they were going to put, a bit like you used to have those really slimline calculators with the little solar cell to power them. They're going to do something like that on a gatefold cover with dice, which would randomly roll. That never happened. But not did the shortening either. As to why it came to an end, I think there was one thing was that Steve and Ian had moved on to other things. They were both in sort of computer game industry at that point. So they had other things to focus their attention on. Again, I've not spoken to them directly about this, so this is supposition. But also I think the sales had dropped off. But the issue was that they'd sold so many. Sales, if you looked at a sales graph, suddenly have gone down here. Now, they were probably selling just as well as any other Puffin publication.
Yeah.
It's just when money men look at it, it's like, oh, well, that's making a loss now. That's not doing as well as it was.
And they all went out on print, did they, at the same time? Did they? They just literally disappeared off bookshelves?
Yeah. So I imagine just whether stock shops had, or whether there was in the distribution centres was used up and they weren't reprinted. So with Bloodbones, the publication date kept getting delayed. So for a while it appeared on Amazon. And so every couple of years it would go forward a few years. And by that point, I knew that the book wasn't coming out. Yeah. But I'd been paid my advance. I mean, yes, it was incredibly frustrating. I wasn't completely out of pocket.
No, okay, that's good. And then it came out eventually anyway.
But yeah, but when it was published by Wizard, they got Tony Hoff to do the artwork again. But that was good because it meant I got to change some of the things that were illustrated. When I got the original illustration, I thought, maybe that's not as interesting as this might have been. And there were some things which weren't in my original draft, which got added in the new version. But yeah, so it did straddle those two worlds.
So we're talking about a point here where the fighting fantasy books started to disappear from bookshelves. Did that coincide with you then doing your own game books? And when did you begin
not
with?
at all.
No, it didn't, right.
So I left university. I trained to be a teacher, but during my final teaching practice, I decided I didn't want to teach because all the teachers in the school I worked were miserable and the head was a horrible person.
Yeah, sounds about
that's
right.
possibly slander. I won't say any more about that anyway. And I thought, I don't want to be like that when I'm ancient and 40. By that point, I'd been commissioned. So from having written one book for Puffin, I then became part of the annual roster. So I was pitching ideas. So I was one of the people who had something published each year for the next couple of years. So I basically persuaded my parents that I could go and give it a go at being a freelance writer. But I didn't want to live at home. And that wasn't for any negative reason. It was more to say, look, if I'm going to do this properly, I'm going to move out. I'm going to rent somewhere, or as it ended up being, lodging with Mark Gascoigne. And I'm going to go to Nottingham because by that point, Mark had told me about his friend Jervis Johnson, who worked at Games Workshop. And he said, they're looking for someone to write the color text. So that's for the little vignettes, the little snippets of short stories or descriptive passages in the rule books.
Okay.
So sometimes it's literally a paragraph. It might be a full 2-page thing describing a scene and a moment in the battle, or it might be, I did one for Dark Elves where it was showing the kind of Machiavellian machinations. It was never published in the Dark Elf book, but it was used in one of the Games Day programs instead. So based on that, I went up to Nottingham and I met Jervis, got taken out for a pub lunch, which was nice, always nice.
Yeah.
And from there, I basically finished uni, moved to Nottingham, was trying to write, I was writing Fighting Fantasy game books. I was trying to write other things, and I was doing freelance work for Games Workshop. So to make ends meet, I also started doing supply teaching. And that was really where I kind of thought, actually, I can do the teaching thing, and it's maybe not as bad as I thought it was. So I kept that going for 2 years, and it got to the crunch point of thinking, I probably need to do something else now. And I applied for teaching jobs. I still wanted to write, but it's kind of reality bites. I've been doing it for 2 years. And bizarrely, I applied for teaching jobs in Nottingham, and including schools where I'd done supply, and they'd had me back. Couldn't even get an interview. And I applied for jobs in London, got 2 interviews, and one of them led to a job, and that's where I worked. For a long time, it's where I met my wife. My son went to school there, so it's really tied up into our history, family history now. So I've done a few army books for Games Workshop. I did 2nd edition Codex Chaos, Angels of Death. Although I was commissioned, Jervis got me to write this. I was the person who first wrote that the lion was still trapped inside the rock. So the first official publication of that. And then I was there when they started talking about starting the Black Library, which started with Inferno magazine, which was originally going to be called Carnage. And so from that, Mark, who I was his lodger at the time, Mark Gascoigne, he then started, having worked for Workshop, he started freelancing for them again, and then got taken on board with Andy Jones setting up the Black Library. So I ended up working for Mark again, but in a different capacity. So by that point, he'd been my editor on Fighting Fantasy. I'd co-written a couple of Sonic the Hedgehog game books with him when we were in Nottingham. And then he was commissioning short stories from me again. He then became the publisher, and it led to novels. So it worked out that while I was in my early days of teaching, in my holidays, I would write short stories for Inferno magazine. At the time, I couldn't cope with doing it during term time. And in the summer, it ended up I was writing novels. But it got to the point where I was teaching full time. I was writing 2 novels a year for Games Workshop. That got quite tough. And I also then started pitching steampunk novels to Bowden Books, which became the Pax Britannia series. I know that's not game books or role-playing games, but that was the time when my wife and I, because I was married by then, we had a young family, and she sat down and said, why don't you give up your job as a deputy head? We'll job share together. And then when you're not, basically a mix of teaching, childcare and writing. And then having done that for a year, she thought, I want to go back to teaching full time. And I gave up teaching. So that was I had a good chunk of 5 years there where I was just a freelance writer.
Yeah, okay.
Although having said that, I still did some supply and exam invigilation, things like that.
Made it work. Yeah. That's
and it swings and roundabouts. I've taught full time in between. I was a librarian, but for the last 4 years now, I've been completely full time writing.
Yeah, and the Games Workshop stuff in particular, is that still in print? A lot of the stuff. I noticed you've done something with Sylvania, which is we played the fantasy role play game a lot, and we've been to Sylvania once or twice. Isn't it Sylvania, the vampire territory?
Well, because eventually they did some game books of their own.
Yeah.
So they only published 4, and I wrote 2 of them. So one 40k one, which is Herald of Oblivion, and then the Vampires Shadows over Sylvania. You can still get my stuff as ebooks on the website. So there's a few of my novels on there, short stories. Yeah. But the last thing I wrote for them was an Age of Sigmar story called Krakenbane's Curse, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
But that was a few years ago.
But the Sylvania one I'd love to get hold of, but it's about £500 on eBay at the moment. So.
I know, it's rare as hen's teeth, and it's really frustrating.
Yeah.
The disclaimer is that I didn't write the rules. Because they're a games company, they did that bit, but I wrote the gamebook part, and I still think it's one of the best that I've written.
Yeah.
But hardly anybody's read it.
No, it looks beautiful.
Yeah. Warhammer roleplay.
It's a solo adventure, isn't it? It's a game book.
So it's set at the time, I think it was about 200 years or 300 years before the current timeline, which probably means it's about the setting of the old world now, I think. But the idea that it was, I've forgotten which vampire it was, maybe Vlad von Carstein or something, had lost a battle, and there was a power vacuum in Sylvania. So that's the premise, is that you can play one of 3 different vampire factions, and whoever your master or mistress is sends you out to whatever the MacGuffin, I can't remember now, to find something. So you go through Sylvania, and one of the fun things was you get to fight things like Chaos and Goblins and Skaven, but you also get to fight the Empire, and then you also fight other undead. So that was a lot of fun to play with, and it's kind of a bit of a hub system, so you can choose where you go at different times.
Yeah, and you've written for many other popular IPs. I mean, you've done Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Sonic the Hedgehog. I noticed you've done Judge Dredd. You've written, this is not Gamebook stuff either, is it, some of this, although the Sonic was.
One of the weirdest gigs was the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, because it was for Russia, but they were commissioned and written in English, and then they were translated, but it meant you couldn't do any word puns. So I remember there being quite a lot about pizza. And there's one bit where you fight they end up fighting some mutant turtles, which are named after Impressionist painters rather than the Renaissance painters.
So moving back into game books, I guess. So we said at the beginning, you've got over 30 game books published, and a lot of these now you publish yourself through the Ace Gamebooks.
Yes, Snowbooks published the first 7 Ace Gamebooks, but in the UK. But it's my thing, Ace Gamebooks. So that's under license, and then various overseas publishers have published them. I've started self-publishing them myself as well now in the UK.
Yeah, and you adapt like public domain stories quite often, don't you, within that? So I think you began with Alice's Nightmare in Wonderland, the Dracula one, which is my favourite one of yours. I've got that one in print. I've got the rest on PDFs. I think that this genre of game books, I think having them in print is the way to go.
I do have a couple of short stories and books that have been published only as ebooks, just as 0s and 1s. And it's frustrating because I can't put those on my writing shelf.
Oh, that's true.
That's kind of how I keep score.
Print on demand, maybe. But so tell us a bit about the Ace Gamebooks, and how do you retain player agency when you're dealing with like a well-known story?
Within the Ace Gamebook series, there are some which are a much closer adaptation. For example, Dracula. That follows the novel very closely. But having said that, as you all know, it's not a particularly linear adventure. There are lots of options where you can do other things, which weren't in Stoker's original, or which I've extrapolated from his original ideas. So it's never stated, but it's implied that Dracula is Vlad Tepes III, Vlad the Impaler, whereas in my book it's explicit. So I sort of got to riff off that a little bit. But yeah, generally, some of them are very, very loosely based on things. So "'Twas the Krampus Night Before Christmas" is based on A Visit from St. Nicholas by Clement Clarke Moore, which is the poem "'Twas the Night Before Christmas when all through the house and the creature was stirring, not even a mouse." So obviously there's only so much you can do with that. But for me, the main thing is that you need to hit certain story beats. Otherwise, what's the point in adapting that story? So for example, when I did Alice's Nightmare in Wonderland, that is written as if it's a sequel. And to begin with, it starts off very like the original, but then it quickly diverges. And it's following the nature of a dream in that Alice doesn't remember having been there before, but other characters in Wonderland do, and she gradually pieces the puzzle together. So you've got to meet the Cheshire Cat, you've got to have the Mad Hatter and the Tea Party. There's got to be, the Queen of Hearts and things like that. But then within that, you can extrapolate on ideas. Another one which is quite close in terms of events of the original poem is Beowulf Beastslayer. What I discovered in writing that is lots of people knew about Beowulf and his mother, but didn't know that there was a third act with the dragon. So that came as quite a surprise to them. But then you can still add things in. And sometimes it's that typical thing where I kind of want to turn everything into a game book, because lots of my novelist friends often say, "How on earth do you write one?" And it's, well, when I'm writing a novel, I'm thinking, well, they could now do this or they could do that. And if you write a game book, great, I get to write both. I don't have to choose one or the other. I think maybe it's because they were the first things I had published. They're just so ingrained, laminated into my soul now that at any opportunity, I'll write it as a game book rather than anything else. I was talking to my wife recently about a new series I've got an idea for children. And she said, "How about not making it a game book?" And it's like...
And you say that for children, but these books that you've written here, what age are you targeting? I mean, they seem more adult friendly than ever before.
If I'm honest, I'm targeting at the people like me who enjoyed reading game books back in the 80s when they were kids, but they're not kids anymore.
Okay, right, good.
And it's one of the weird things is that in the UK, although there's all sorts of game books published, they're still seen in the wider culture or within publishing as being a children's genre. Whereas overseas, I say overseas, I just only mean in Europe, but there's a much wider variety. People have published all sorts of things in Germany, Spain, France, which are nothing to do with children, but they're still game books. And they've always been popular and people accepting them. So they kind of got stuck with that label. And then I don't know why it persists. Maybe it's people think, oh, I used to enjoy these as a child, now I'll give them to my children. It just perpetuates. And although that's good in passing it on, it's also saying you can do other things with game books. You can, like I say, make them more adult. Primarily for most of my game books, I would say a literate 10-year-old is fine going upwards. There's nothing too graphic. That said, I do say to people when they're asking what to start with, I wouldn't recommend Dracula for children. No. But when I say not for children, I'm thinking I read kind of Stephen King and James Herbert when I was about 14. So it's probably all right from then onwards, really. And there's certainly nothing graphic. As I put it, there's no sexy fun times. There might be some gratuitous murder. That was one of the things writing for Games Workshop. Having people, no Space Marines ripping people's heads off and their spinal column coming out, that was fine. To suggest that somebody might have made love to somebody else, no.
It's amazing what you can get away with. You can do sacrifice and everything else like that and barely raises an eyebrow.
There are some quite gruesome themes, aren't there? In the old, you were talking about House of Hell. Was there?
Yeah, it must be sacrifices in that, wasn't there? Wasn't it? I remember the Chris knife.
Is it the district nurse? Yeah,
exactly.
I mean, when you say there's a satanic panic, it maybe wasn't completely unfounded.
No, I think we earned it in some way, don't we?
I was wondering, do you take commission?
They do. Well, I do commission work now. So at the moment, I try and publish one Ace game book a year, but I don't always manage it because of other commissions. But for example, just happen to have one here. Valiant is the first in a series I've written for War Cradle Studios. So that came out earlier this year, and I've finished the second one for them. And we're talking about a third. I write Arkham Horror investigator game books for Fantasy Flight and Aconite.
Probably end up getting
so
those.
Again, there's 3 of those. I'm working a pitch for a 4th at the moment. Yeah, pretty much. It will work for money. It is my job.
Fantastic.
And while it's fun to indulge myself and do my own things, if someone comes along saying, well, we'll pay you some money up front to do something, it's, and again, it's things that there's something about the setting. I think, that'll be fun at the end of the day. That's something I might be able to enjoy.
I noticed the Arkham Horror stuff that you had on sale. I didn't realize it was associated with Fantasy Flight. So with the board games, it's all linked in with their board games.
It's completely linked in. So with those, we have the conceit that although it's still you're one of the investigators from the game. So they're all invested already in the game. Each book has 3 different investigators in it. But while they're in that particular book and you do get your own introduction for that character, the idea is you can play any adventure with any character. So you could play this one with the character in the first book, or you could take the character of this and go back and play the first one. Yeah, so 3 so far, but I think there's already about 14, maybe 16 different playable characters, some in different books. There was one which was in the back of a graphic novel they did, The Terror at the End of Time. Sometimes they just release other downloadable characters when a new book comes out. So we're gradually getting through them all.
So because we're a role-playing game podcast, initially we're talking about the role-playing game spin-offs of your own game books, because you've done that with a number of, well, at least 2 I know. It's the Beowulf one you did, and the 'Twas the Night, the Christmas one.
Yes.
They were originally game books that you've then converted into role-playing games. So do you play role-playing games yourself, or is it just something you saw as a natural way to sort of take your writing in that direction?
I have on and off. I'm not currently part of a role-playing group. I was a couple of years ago, and I definitely did it as a child, but it was just one of those things where I thought, I'm not completely done with this idea. I think I could do more with it. And rather than write a sequel to Beowulf Beastslayer, for example, it's like, well, you could use that setting and have group adventures. It was actually Herot, which I wanted to write first, but then I went with 'Twas because I don't really know why, but it kind of, again, that's extrapolated from the game book. So if you played the game book, there'll be things in the role-playing game which will be familiar, but then there's other random elements. And having done that, I then went back and wrote 'Twas, which is only very slightly more complicated. I mean, they're very rules light in there.
Yeah. The Twas series is a Christmas-based role-playing game, and
Yes.
they are aimed more at children. I played them with my own children. We played them the last few years at Christmas.
I mean, the conceit is with the Twas Gamebook is that, again, interesting you say about you're not a child. Lots of people assume that the hero of that is a child, because it said the first thing that happens is you hear a noise downstairs on Christmas Eve, and you go downstairs in your pajamas and your dressing gown and your slippers, and people always immediately think that means it's a child. And it's like, it's never stated that you're a child.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, the conceit in the role-playing game is that you're a group of toys that are brought to life by Father Christmas, but then there's plenty in that that's still a bit sort of creepy and unsettling. And Tony Hoff's artwork is brilliant, invoking that sort of slightly unsettling fairy tale look. The problem was it's a Christmas role-playing game, which kind of limits your audience. So I did publish Christmas in July as a conceit based in the same setting. I do have more plans for that, but again, it's time and what makes the most sense to spend my time on.
It seems obvious you have a great affection for Christmas, because you've released. I think there was something else about Scrooge. I noticed one of your previous releases was a.
I've done
story,
yes.
wasn't
That's a game book I want to write. Actually, is one based on Christmas Carol, sort of, certainly on the characters and Dickensian characters. But years ago, I wrote a book on the history of Christmas, and it's been republished by another publisher with extra stuff in it. So the first version was called "What Is Myrrh Anyway," which was one of those things where the publisher gives you the title and it's like, it didn't sell because people were, well, that's a weird title. But it's a quote from Monty Python's Life of Brian. And then it got republished later as, what was it called? Robins, Kings and Brussels Sprouts, Everything You Wanted to Know About Christmas.
Yeah, okay.
So I've done a lot of research on that, which is then I think partly why I thought I can throw it into a role-playing game now.
Got it all there. And Box of Delights, of course. And I noticed that this didn't begin as a game book. I'm quite disappointed about that, actually, because I'd have loved it to have been a game book. It's one of my favourite stories, and of course the TV series too. But it's a role-playing game, which immediately caught my eye. Do you think you might do a game book version of that, or is that?
If you've read Twas, I don't know if you have, but there is a section in that which is the Box of Delights. So I've already kind of scratched that itch. It's not the proper plot. I mean, maybe it would be a fun thing to do, but I think I've probably done that now.
Oh, that's in there, is it? Yeah, I didn't play the Twas game book. I just went to the RPGs.
Having written the game book and then put that little nod to it in there. So you've got Cole Hawlings and Barney Dog and the Box of Delights itself. I then just thought, because I have random thoughts like this sometimes, but I thought, I wonder if you can get the rights for that, because I'd also written the role-playing game. So I thought, I could do a supplement based on the Box of Delights. And I contacted the estate via the Society of Authors. I said, this is what I'm proposing. Are you up for that? And they said yes. And they said, this is what we charge you for the rights to do that for this period of time. I was lucky because it was around COVID. So while I was rather slow at writing it, I was able to get my license extended slightly. But as I started doing it, I realized this is way bigger than a supplement for Twas. So I decided to do it a self-contained game, because I thought equally there'll be people who come to it because it's Box of Delights. And I wasn't convinced I'd be able to sell them that and then sell them the role-playing game. So I thought, although the rules are very similar to Twas, the role-playing game, it's all self-contained. And I think that comes from having written game books. And also watching lots of unbookings where people, that they get these great supplements and they think, well, now I've got to buy another book. Or you get a role-playing game and then there's no adventure in it. So I've kind of thought, no, everything you need is in that one book.
Yeah.
You don't need to buy anything else to enjoy this.
Well, we're hoping to do a live play of that ourselves. For our
I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, over our Christmas episodes. Yeah, we'll do a lot of it as live role playing. And my son is going to be playing Kay Harker, because I think you need a child's voice. His voice hasn't quite broken yet. I hope it doesn't in the next month or two.
It might do. It might do.
He's 14, so it's coming. And yeah, so it's great to see a role playing game of that. So with the role playing game side of what you do, is that something you think they're going to do more of? Is that something that's been rewarding enough for you financially, I guess, as in sales? How does that compare to the rest of your work?
It's something I would like. I have a desire to do more. When it comes to practicalities, at the moment, it appears to make more sense for me to write game books and role-playing games. It's good and bad. I mean, I've got loads of ideas. It's not that I'm short of things, but every so often I think, well, that would be fun. Because at one point I thought I'd like to write a role-playing game in the setting of The Wicked Wizard of Oz. I think probably I wouldn't do that one now, but I had ideas for doing something based around Neverland, Here Be Monsters. But in terms of the reach I've managed to get with those, with the crowdfunding and also then later sales, it doesn't compare to my track record with Gamebooks. So,
no, okay.
Although it might take me just as long, if not longer, to write the role-playing game than the game book.
So we're going to move on to final random questions, I think, now. I think the first one isn't particularly random. I'd just like to make sure I don't forget to ask you, what are you working on at the moment? What is your next release likely to be?
So what I'm working on at the moment is Fighting Fantasy Fest. I don't know when this will go out, but I'll give a quick plug. So it's on Saturday, the 5th of September at the University of West London in Ealing. So we do every 2 years a day's event celebrating fighting fantasy and game books. And our guests of honour are Sir Ian Livingstone and the artist Carl Kopinski. And they've both collaborated on Ian's new book, which is The Tomb of the Golden Skull. And there'll be exclusive hardback releases. We've got other guests, authors, editors, writers from the series history. We've got role-playing game companies, gaming merchandise, all sorts of stuff around game books. And they all come for the day to Ealing, have a fantastic time. And this is the sixth time we've done it now. So
okay.
So that's what's taking up most of my time. In terms of what my next release will be, it's another Ace game book. So it's number 9, and it's called 100 Acre Wood. So it's inspired by Winnie the Pooh, but it's if Winnie the Pooh met Pet Sematary. Because I can't just do something nice. I have to do something twisted and horrible. Yeah. And it's unusual in that it's only 100 sections long, and that's intentional because it's 100 Acre Wood, and it's also 100 years since the publication of Winnie the Pooh this year. But because of when it comes out of copyright in the UK, it's not till next year. So that will come out early next year. It's all written. The art's all done. I've just got to get it to layout and then get it printed. But that will be the next release. And it's also unusual. When you say about who do I write game books for, this is definitely not for children, because the way I sum it up is it's a game book about grief and guilt. And I'm not aware of that. I certainly haven't read any myself where somebody's done that before, because part of it for me is that challenge of what else could you do with the game book? And then you get an idea and you think, it won't leave me alone. I've got to sort of work that one out and exercise it. Fingers crossed, I think I've pulled it off, because it's quite a tricky one to do.
Yeah. Okay.
And then after that, like I say, there'll be another Valiant game book, which will be coming out. I'm not entirely sure when yet. Probably not before the end of the year. So actually, that could be the next release. But there's one of those waiting in the wings.
Yeah.
And then after that, it depends on commissions and fitting my own stuff in, but I know what I want to do for Ace Game Book number 10. But I'm always very cagey about those, because it does take me a while to get around to putting them out. I don't want to kind of give away all my ideas.
Oh, you're
not that I'm making out they're better than anybody else's, but it'd just be annoying if I released one. And then, because I have heard other friends who've written novels, they've had some pen name publicized, then somebody else has put out a self-published book under that name, and it's completely tarnished their brand and any hopes of being commissioned by the publisher in the future. So it does have real repercussions.
Okay, yeah. Keep it under your hat, for sure.
You've turned up in some artwork in 40K. I was talking to a new game shop that I found yesterday in Lee, just off of Lee Green. And he pulled out this book, and it had a picture of you amongst playing one of the characters in it, I think it was.
There you go. Immortalized.
I've definitely been drawn into a Troika book. Get it at Cutler's. Tony Hoff drew me in the back. I'm wearing it looks like I'm wearing pajamas with a green man on the front. And I'm going like this.
That's it, yes.
I'm in a few now, because Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson appear as cameos in various fighting fantasy illustrations. And Ian quite often still has himself drawn in. And I didn't do it for ages, and I thought, actually, I'm paying for this artwork. Why not? So I am in some of the Ace game books now. So the latest one that came out was Shakespeare versus Cthulhu. So I'm Dr. Faustus in that. And I'm Renfield in Dracula. And in Herot, I'm a scold telling the tales in the feast hall.
That's I'll have to look out for those.
Awesome.
Yeah. Want a random question?
A random one. Okay. You mentioned that you made up some new mechanics for the Fighting Fantasy book. I just wonder what your favourite new mechanic that you come up with was. Was it saying Dastardlita to kill them off?
I've done it in a couple of them now. Actually, we did it in... I helped Steve Jackson write his 40th anniversary game book, which was Secrets of Salomonis. And that you have to keep track of the days of the week. And it effectively allows you to keep track of time as you can choose different tasks and things. But I did a similar thing with a fighting fantasy book called Stormslayer, which was published when Icon Books, Wizard Books were doing it. So probably not very well known. But that has a day of the week tracker. And it's all based around the weather and elements. And in Fighting Fantasy, people know there are days of the week named after particular elements. So there's Earth Day, Fire Day, Storms Day. and certain elemental creatures will be stronger on the days associated with their element, and the opposite element, they'll be much weaker on those days. So that was quite a fun thing to put in.
I love that. That's great.
It wasn't too difficult, was it?
Yeah, feels like a fair mechanic.
No, that's fair. Apart from the sequence in the volcano, I got a bit carried away.
Oh, yeah.
Have you put any unfair mechanics in that you regret, or you think?
Oh goodness, probably loads.
I think that's a bit harsh.
I think the poison one in Curse of the Mummy probably didn't help an already very difficult game book where you gain poison points until eventually there's enough that it kills you.
Oh, that's
Do you know that? I think I might have played that one, actually.
Do you have any new mechanics in mind for new books? Anything to sort of like evolve the genre?
I'm trying to think now. Something which I've done with the Ace Gamebook series as I've become more confident is you can play as different characters.
Okay.
And the story changes based on that character. So that's an ongoing thing. And I manage that by, rather than saying every so often, if you're this person, it's just that there's an icon at the paragraph. And you know that if that icon is linked to your character, that you have to either deduct 10 and go to that section, or add 10 and read that section instead.
Right. Yeah.
So it's a way of changing the story based on the character. So it can mean that sometimes there'll be an encounter where if there's 4 different characters, it's completely 4 different experiences. But in most of the cases, it will only affect one of the characters, or you can split it up in different ways just by using the icons.
They introduced that in Scorpion Swamp, didn't they? I think it was the first time we had a choice of
in Scorpion
alignments.
Swamp, you can choose 3 different quests. So you can do the one for the good wizard, the neutral wizard, or the evil wizard.
Yeah.
So this is slightly different in that the character you play has different reactions to certain things. Or
I was put off with Scorpion Swamp. I remember because it was the first one that came after the first 7.
You wanted to play evil, didn't you? That's why
I always thought it was odd how you could actually go back to locations you'd been at before, and that kind of didn't quite get my head around that, because that was what I like the idea that you
early
always
open world.
Yeah, really open world.
I think that's one of its strengths. So with, for example, the next Ace Gamebook number 10, there are 4 different characters you can play as, and I realised as I was starting work on it, one of them would be illiterate. So there's a bit where you read something, but if you're that character, you have to go to something else because you can't read.
Wow, yeah.
So playing with it that way.
Oh, nice.
I like that, yeah.
So another question. What is your favourite game book monster or villain? Doesn't have to be fighting fantasy.
The ones which spring to mind are fighting fantasy. So the Blood Beast. And I think just because of the illustration on the front of Death Trap Dungeon, in terms of the book itself, it's just another encounter. But it was so vividly portrayed on the front by Ian McCaig. I mean, when you look at it, it's a big fat slug thing in a pool of slime in a dungeon. I'm not sure how lethal it would actually be because it looks like it's stuck there.
That's true.
But that said, equally, there's so much menace in it, and the way that the eyes of the extra blister eyes and things. I just love that one, and it's a good name. And then in terms of villains, I think probably Balthus Dyer, just because he was that kind of warlord sorcerer, and the fact there's that element of strategy to how you conduct the battle at the end, and also just the idea that. Big spoilers now if you haven't read Citadel of Chaos, but if you expose him to sunlight, that's one way to kill him. And the idea that going down that path of dark magic has effectively corrupted him so much that daylight is anathema to him.
Yeah.
This
is a question we might all answer, us blokes too. Which is your favourite fighting fantasy book?
I was intrigued because I'll be honest, I was sent some notes before this, so I'd have an idea what to talk about.
Yeah.
And you did say, I think we can all guess. So I'm interested to know what you think it might be.
Oh, I think it's probably Warlock of Firetop Mountain, because it's the first one that you bought.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I said. Yeah, because mine's my first one as well. So maybe Warlock, but I don't know.
That would probably be the politic answer, but the actual answer is Dead of Night,
right.
which was the first Stephen Hand adventure.
Okay.
So it's number 40 in the series, so maybe not as well known. Cover by Terry Oakes with a demon coming out of like a volcanic rift in the ground and a tower in the background. But illustrated by Martin McKenna, who was one of my favourite fighting fantasy artists, much missed. And again, just the game design, the idea of going to different villages. There was a map by Leo Hartas in the front. It just had everything. And also there's clever things in it in that there's so many information you're given in the text. If you then look at one of the pictures carefully, it gives you a clue without ever making it explicit what the choice should be when it maybe looks a bit more random.
Yeah,
that's really
so
good.
I just think that one, and all sorts of the encounters themselves, there's things like a land blight, which is effectively this demonic factory which is sprouted up on the spot. And it's, I'd say Dead of Night.
Yeah, okay. What was yours, Stephen?
If I had to pick one, I suppose the first one I bought was City of Thieves, which I absolutely love, but I quite like the other ones where the genre deviates as well. So I like Rebel Planet, and I love Appointment with Fear. Absolutely love those ones.
Yeah.
And Creature of Chaos. So I got 4.
Can't pick one out.
Creature of Havoc. Well, City of Thieves. I played that again and again and again. I loved it.
Black Sand is a great place to hold role-playing game adventures, isn't it? Yeah.
Oh yeah, brilliant creation. Absolutely.
Yeah, so that one, if I had to pick one.
I loved what Mark Gascoigne and Pete Tamlin did with the Advanced Fighting Fantasy, the Dungeoneer series. It was the second one was called Black Sand, and they really expanded the town for the city.
It was
and there's a lot
good.
of humour in that book as well. That's down to Mark. That's classic Mark. Lots of tongue-in-cheek puns and sarcastic comments and things.
Yeah, Warhammer Fantasy role-play feel about it as well.
Yeah, it's lovely.
John, yours?
I guess Citadel, but I was very much into martial arts at the time as well, so they did a Way of the Samurai one, and I really liked that.
Sword of the Samurai, yeah. And then there was the Way of the Tiger, which isn't fighting fantasy, but that had Jamie Thompson and Mark Smith.
Yeah, but Citadel of Chaos, number 2.
Yeah.
Mine was Death Trap Dungeon. That's the first one I bought. It does stand the test of time. It became a computer game, didn't it, as well? And I noticed that Dragon Meat, where we see you every year, by the way, and anybody that wants to come and see you in person, Dragon Meat's a great place to come along and buy your books. I noticed that there was a Death Trap Dungeon release. I think it was the figures and Blood Beast as a miniature. I didn't buy it. I wish I had.
Yeah, so there's the Fighting Fantasy Heroes, which Dan Jack of Blue Giant Studios has sculpted them, and they're being put out by My Mini Factory. I think it's still live on BackerKit if you want to check it out.
Is it still there?
Nice.
Okay.
I think so. So look for Fighting Fantasy Heroes.
I'll have a look at that. Yeah.
I do love Death Trap. I have to say, City of Thieves and Death Trap, I think, is where they really got into their stride. And there are links between the two books as well. Because Sour Belly, one of the troll guards in Port Blacksand, his sister is Poison Ivy, who was in Death Trap Dungeon.
Okay.
And also by that point, Ian particularly was building the world of Alancia. So it's sort of implied that you go from City of Thieves to Death Trap Dungeon, and from there you go to Island of Lizard King and things. So it's, I like that.
Yeah. I love them all.
Yeah.
And I've got some more reading to do, apparently. So I didn't realise that, there were quite as many, because I'd just gone into regular role playing.
Because Scholastic now have the license to publish Fighting Fantasy. So, like we say, there's a new one out from Ian. I think they've published 5 new. To check that now.
Yeah.
New Fighting Fantasy game books since they got the license, which is back in 2017 now. Yeah.
And you've worked with Steve Jackson on his latest release.
Yeah,
you worked with him on that.
Secrets of Salamonis. Yeah.
Yeah. That must have been great. Was that the first one you've actually written with one of the co-creators of Fighting Fantasy?
Yes. And then Cyrene and I co-wrote Magic Realms, The Art of Fighting Fantasy as well, which came out last year.
I did have another question here about the history of Fighting Fantasy. When you were researching and writing You Are the Hero, was there any little things you discovered about the culture around the early game book boom that perhaps surprised you?
There are some interesting stories, which is frustrating now, because it's that classic thing where I can't share them. So there are things that I discovered which people ask me not to them include.
Okay. Yeah.
So there are a couple of those which were...
But the fact that there are those is bad enough.
I think when you look back at the success of the series and now, is how much of it they were just winging it. Because, we've had one book and it's been reprinted. Now we want 2 more. Now we want one every 2 months. Now we have to get other people in. And you'd think there was some sort of master plan, but it was just riding that wave of success. And it's incredible when you look back and what was achieved just within those first 10 years, getting to 50 game books. I was trying to get to 10 game books of my own Ace Gamebook series, and I managed to get to 8 within 10 years.
Wow.
10, that's true. So it was a crazy time. And
And just now looking back, how many people who are movers and shakers in the industry were influenced by Fighting Fantasy? There's, I've forgotten his name, but the designer behind Dark Souls, the computer game, was a huge fan.
Oh, that's why it's so easy to die.
Dara O'Brien, just a celebrity name that springs to mind. Charlie Higson, people like that are reading them when they're teenagers. So people who are the people who are running publishing companies and games companies and designing things now, they were all brought up on it. It was like you say, it was their gateway to role playing and tabletop war games and things.
So the effect is there.
Amazing.
Yeah. Any other? You were going to ask Jonathan whether he cheats, but
I think we established that. Yeah.
Yes.
It was volunteered.
He must have cheated in it.
Yeah, as Syrian calls it, it's the 5-finger bookmark. So you make a choice and you keep the fingers in the page to see, well, I didn't like that one, I'll go back and try something else. So I absolutely cheated, partly because I wanted to get to the end and enjoy the story, and then also as it got further on, it's wanting to see how the game works are constructed and what happens if you do this. And I try to write my books now for people who want to play them fairly, Beowulf Beastslayer has been criticised for being much harder to get to a certain ending, but my reason for that is that if you follow the true story, as in the epic poem, it leads to one ending. And to fight that ending, you ought to do something exceptional. So that's my justification. But at least I knew that that's what I was doing with that one, rather than, oh dear, I've designed this poorly. It was a definite intention.
Well, I think now I know that when I play your game books, which I'm going to be doing, I won't cheat and I'll play them because they've been written in the right spirit. I'll believe what you say.
I'll be checking.
I have stated in the rules because, again, some people, it means a lot to them to be given permission, should we say. So it says you can, because with the Ace game books, you can use dice or playing cards. So I say you can play it that way. And I say, or you can ignore the dice rolling and the random number generation and you can just read the story. You can succeed, win every battle, succeed at every attribute test, but you still might not succeed in actually completing the quest. So I kind of accept that not everyone's going to want to sit there rolling dice on the commuter, but they still might want to enjoy the story.
Yeah.
Good idea.
That's a good idea.
Yep.
Yeah, some of them printed random dice rolls at the bottom.
The new Final Fantasy releases did that.
Yeah. You flip the books, didn't you?
Yeah. That's right. So and play them on a train. So for wrapping things up, I think what we're obviously primarily focused on here is introducing people into different elements of the role-playing game hobby. And I think this is a perfect gateway, the game books are, to be doing that yourself. I mean, if you're listening to this podcast and you haven't played a role-playing game yet, and you're thinking of doing so, then pick up some of these books, pick up Jonathan's stuff and keep you ticking over in the meantime, but also give you a good groundwork into what a role-playing game is ultimately in any case. And as I say, we this was a gateway for us directly. Without Fighting Fantasy, I don't know whether I'd be role playing. Let's be honest. I don't think I would have encountered it or thought about it. It was it was one thing and then the next for us as children. And I think as adults that can do the same for you too. And a lot of our listeners have children too, and don't buy them a game book.
You still get them all, can you? Yeah.
There's also the other thing, something I did with the Bloodsword ones was you extrapolate on what's in there to do a role-play game. So you can reverse engineer it, and that
definitely
encourages you to maybe not get your players to read the game book until afterwards, but you can always
absolutely.
Spend on them.
Yeah, really one of them is a classic example is you just increase the number of enemies by how many players you've got. It's as basic as that. So you can definitely do that with them as well.
Yeah.
I think the main difference between a game book and a role-playing game is you do have a finite number of choices. You can't do absolutely anything, whereas in a role-playing game, you have much more freedom of choice. And as long as your DM or your GM is open to suggestion and can sort of do a bit of theatre on the fly and isn't completely hidebound by, no, you've got to go this way because that's what I've written notes for. Yeah, I mean, it can really go anywhere. Whereas in the book is the DM, but can only have so many responses. Otherwise it gets unwieldy. Yeah.
Really works.
So, Jonathan, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you.
I'd like to think that we're going to see you again soon because we're always at Dragon Meet.
We'll say hi.
That's it. But yeah, thanks for joining us. And I'm hoping everybody's a bit clearer now on there are many routes into this hobby and many different elements and facets of it. And this is certainly one of them. And you should not let it pass you by.
It's a great one. Yeah. Recommend it to everybody. Yeah.
Thank you.
If people wanted to find you online and discover more about you, I'll add some extra bits and pieces and links in the note.
You can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky. I've got jonathangreenauthor.com, acegamebooks.com. They'll get you to my stuff and see what I'm up to.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So we're done. Thanks, Jonathan. Really appreciate your time.